summer 1944. Normandy. For an American tanker, sitting in the belly of his M4 Sherman, the sound was the most terrifying part. It wasn't the roar of his own engine, not the rumble of battle. It was that dull metallic clang that echoed when his 75mm shell fired from close range just bounced right off the frontal armor of a German Tiger or a Panther. That sound meant one thing: you'd pissed it off, but you hadn't heard it. Now it was your turn to die. Then another sound would come. The dry, sharp crack of a German 88mm cannon. The Sherman, that tall, clumsy tank with its thin skin, would just turn into an inferno. It ignited instantly. Surviving crews would tell stories of how everything inside burned with such a fury it felt like the devil himself had lit a cigar off their gasoline engine. The German tankers laughed at them. They despised the Sherman. For them, for the aces sitting in their perfect deadly machines, this wasn't a tank, it was a rolling coffin. They gave it nicknames filled with contempt. The British called it the Ronson after the Lighter, whose ad said, "Lights up the first time, every time." The Germans were more direct. They called them asterisk. Tommycooker's asterisk, hinting that the crew inside burned alive. The Poles, who fought in Shermans, called it something even simpler: the burning grave. This was a tank that was known to be inferior to its enemy. Its gun couldn't penetrate their armor, its armor couldn't stop their shells, it was taller, which made it an easier target. To destroy one Tiger, it took 5 Shermans, 5 American crews who had to risk their lives to get around the steel monster from the flank or the rear to try to put a shell into its vulnerable spot. This wasn't a fair fight, it was suicide. Yet it was this very tank, this colossal failure, this death trap that won the war. It was these burning coffins that ultimately defeated the German times Panzers asterisk. How? Well, the answer to that question isn't a story about technology. It's a story about philosophy. It's the story of how America wages war. When the United States entered the Second World War, it, ironically, had no modern medium tank. The Sherman's design was developed in a frantic hurry. There was no time for long tests, for slow, deliberate improvements. The Army needed a tank. Now, the strategic decision was made that would define the fate of the entire tank war on the Western Front. The German philosophy involved creating the perfect weapon. Their Tigers, their Panthers were masterpieces of engineering, complex, powerful, deadly. Each tank was a work of art, but they were expensive, difficult to produce. The American philosophy was different: brutal, simple, relentless. They couldn't build the best tank, but they could build the most tanks. They decided not to play at dueling. They decided to create an avalanche. The numbers of this avalanche are just staggering. Against 1,835 German Tigers, plus Royal Tigers, with 4,800 Panthers, a total of 6,635 perfect killing machines, America put up 40,000 Shermans. Some estimates go as high as 50,000. This was not a one-on-one battle. This was not a knightly joust. This was a bar fight where one guy had a knife, the other guy showed up with 100 of his friends. The German tankers laughed at the Sherman. They laughed when their shells bounced off a Tiger's armor. They laughed when one of their shots turned an American tank into a fireball. But they stopped laughing when, after destroying one Sherman, they saw 5 more crawling over the hill, then 10 more behind them. They could win a battle. They could win 10 battles, but they could not win a war against an assembly line. Before we begin, I just want to say one thing. This channel tells the stories of people forged from steel and fire, not ordinary flesh and blood. Those who fought for our future deserve to be remembered. If you believe that too, please subscribe. Every video here honors their memory. I voice each story myself because they deserve a human voice, not a cold AI one. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if your family went through that terrible war, share a few words about them. Let's remember them together. All right, let's get to the story. America's automotive giants, Chrysler, Ford, General Motors, had converted their factories into giant factories of death. Where family sedans were made yesterday, now, with a roar, a screech, tanks were born. Dozens, hundreds, thousands. It was a naked, brutal demonstration of American industrial power. The Germans created masterpieces, the Americans created a weapon. They made so many of them that their sheer mass was meant to crush the Third Reich. The story of the Sherman is the story of how quantity became a quality all its own, the quality of an overwhelming, unending force. The American philosophy of war was simple. If you can't outthink the enemy, you have to outproduce him. The Sherman was the perfect tool for that. It wasn't sophisticated. It wasn't elegant. It was a sledgehammer. Heavy, reliable, most importantly, endless. From a technical standpoint, it was the embodiment of American pragmatism. A weight of over 30 tons, 19 feet of steel, a top speed of 30 miles per hour. It could travel 100 miles, cross a 3-foot ford, climb a 2-foot wall. It wasn't built for parades. It was built to go forward. Always forward. Its gun, the 75mm, later the more powerful 76mm, was not the best, but it was dependable, it fired quickly, it never ran out of shells. Its armor, just 3 inches thick in the most protected areas, was not the best, but it was simple to manufacture. The entire tank was designed with one goal in mind. It could be assembled like a set of Legos, quickly, cheaply, in enormous quantities. But there was a hidden advantage in this simplicity, one that the German engineers, obsessed with their perfection, could never quite grasp. The Sherman was reliable, incredibly, absurdly reliable. Its engines, developed by General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, were the hearts of workhorses. They didn't break down. If they did, any American farmer with a wrench could fix them right there in the field, under fire. The German Tigers, the Panthers, were like temperamental, thoroughbred racehorses. They required meticulous care, special tools, hours of maintenance. They often broke down at the worst possible moment. The Sherman was a mule, a stubborn, tough mule that just kept going forward through the mud, the snow, the fire. This reliability gave American tankers one advantage that couldn't be measured in numbers: confidence. They knew their machine wouldn't fail them. It might burn, it might explode, but it wouldn't just stall in the middle of a field, leaving them helpless. The world first saw this advantage in the sands of North Africa. When the first Shermans arrived in Egypt to join Field Marshal Montgomery's 8th British Army, the Germans of Rommel's times, Afrika Korps times, didn't pay them much attention. They knew the British had received some new American tanks, but they underestimated their potential. It was a fatal mistake. In the Battle of El Alamein, the Sherman came as a shock. It was head, shoulders above their outdated times. PZ, KPFW, V3, PZ, KPFW, IV times tanks. Its gun easily penetrated their armor. Its speed allowed it to dictate the terms of the battle. The result was catastrophic for the Germans. The British, who for the first time in a long while tasted a major victory, were ecstatic. They lost their heads. They proclaimed the Sherman the best tank in the world. They gave it its name after the American General Sherman. They were in love. After the battle, they conducted a thorough review. The armor good, especially the frontal plate. The gun excellent. The speed incredible. They found only one serious problem. The tank caught fire too easily when hit. It was an alarming sign. But the euphoria of victory drowned it out. They decided the problem could be solved by welding additional 1-inch armor plates to the hull sides to protect the ammunition racks. The U.S. Army, watching this triumph, hastily gave the Sherman its official blessing. As it turned out later, far too hastily. Because while the British were celebrating, while the Americans were ramping up production, German engineers were already preparing their answer. That answer would change everything. As the war progressed, the euphoria faded, giving way to a grim reality. On the fields of Italy, then in the bloody hedgerows of Normandy, the Shermans met a new generation of German beasts. The Panthers, the Tigers. Suddenly, the best tank in the world turned into a death trap. It turned out that against these new monsters, its armor was cardboard. Its gun was a child's toy. American British tankers watched in horror as their shells just bounced off the frontal armor of the German tanks, not even leaving a scratch. Then came the return shot. Their world turned to fire. That's when the Sherman earned its real, bloody names. Ronson, the Burning Grave, Asterisk, Tommycooker, Asterisk. U.S. Army studies later proved that the main cause of the fires was not the gasoline engines, as many thought. The cause was the placement of the ammunition in unprotected racks above the tracks. A direct hit there was a guaranteed way to turn the tank into a furnace. But for the tanker burning alive inside, this technical detail meant nothing. He knew only one thing: his tank was a coffin. The only thing separating him from death was his own courage, the ingenuity of his comrades, most importantly, the fact that behind him there were always 4 more Shermans just like his, ready to get revenge. The war had turned into mathematics. America was going to win it through sheer, endless, relentless numbers. The war had turned into mathematics. America was going to win it through sheer, endless, relentless numbers. But for the tankers sitting inside this mathematical formula, that was small comfort. When you're burning alive in your steel coffin, you don't care that your 1,000th replacement just rolled off the assembly line in Detroit. You're just burning. In the summer of 1944 in Normandy, American tankers were burning. They were burning by the hundreds. The euphoria after the victories in the desert, where the Sherman had seemed like a king, had vanished like smoke. In the bloody, tangled hedgerows of Normandy, they met the real German beasts. They met the Panther, they met the Tiger. Suddenly, the best tank in the world had become a death trap. This wasn't just a fight, it was a hunt. The American Shermans were the prey. Imagine a typical engagement. An American Sherman moves cautiously down a narrow road, flanked by hedgerows. Suddenly, the crew spots it, camouflaged, low-slung, predatory. A Tiger. It's 1,000 yards away. For the Sherman, it's an almost invisible dot. For the Tiger, it's a perfect target. The American commander roars into the intercom. The gunner gets the German beast in his sights. Fire! The 75mm shell flies across the field. The American crew listens in horror for that sound, the dull, metallic clang. The shell that was supposed to rip through armor just bounces off the Tiger's frontal plate like a pea off a wall. They didn't even scratch it, they only made it angry. Then it's their turn. The Tiger crew doesn't rush, they're professionals. They calmly, methodically aim their 88mm cannon. The sound of its shot isn't a boom. It's a dry, sharp crack, like the snap of a whip. Almost instantly, the Sherman shudders from the impact. The supersonic shell punches through its thin armor, as if it wasn't there. It tears men to pieces, hits the ammo rack, the tank explodes. That's when the Sherman got its real bloody names. Ronson, the Burning Grave, Tommycooker, U.S. Army studies later proved that the main cause of the fires wasn't the gasoline engines, as many thought. Gasoline rarely ignited. The cause was the diabolical placement of the ammunition in unprotected racks right above the tracks. A direct hit there was a guaranteed way to turn the tank into a furnace. The German tankers knew it. They aimed for it. But for the tanker burning alive inside, this technical detail meant nothing. He knew only one thing: his tank was a coffin. The only thing separating him from death was his own courage, the ingenuity of his comrades, most importantly, the fact that behind him there were always 4 more Shermans just like his, ready to get revenge. At that moment, the American spirit showed itself. Not the spirit of the generals in their headquarters who had sent them to fight in these tin cans, but the spirit of the ordinary GI. The spirit of the farmer from Iowa, the mechanic from Detroit, sitting inside this trap. When they realized their weapon was shit, they didn't give up. They didn't mutiny. They started to improvise. They started turning their Ronsons into ugly but survivable monsters. This was a war not of engineers, but of soldierly ingenuity. They started strapping everything they could find to their tanks. They covered them with sandbags, hoping it would stop German-shaped charges. They welded spare track links to the front armor. They attached logs, pieces of scrap metal to the sides, any junk that might give them at least 1 extra % chance of survival. Their tanks turned into porcupines, covered in improvised, ugly, but hard-won armor. When General Patton saw this, he became furious. He forbade the use of sandbags. His experts told him they were not only ineffective, but also increased vulnerability. The extra weight was killing the suspension. But Patton was more than just a tyrant, he was a fighter. He understood the problem. He proposed his own brutal but effective solution. He ordered his maintenance battalions to cut armor plates from knocked-out German, American tanks to weld them onto the Sherman's frontal armor. So, on the fields of France, field-expedient monsters were born. Shermans with double, sometimes triple armor. They were slower, they were clumsier. But they gave the crew a chance. The engineers back home weren't sleeping either. They developed a new ammunition storage system, the so-called wet stowage. The shells were now stored on the floor of the hull in containers surrounded by water jackets. This significantly reduced the chance of a fire. They developed new hypervelocity armor-piercing rounds that could penetrate a Panther's armor. But there weren't many of them. They were given to the tank destroyers first. They even created a special version, the M4A3E2 Jumbo. This was a Sherman on steroids, with frontal armor so thick it surpassed even that of a Tiger. But only 254 of them were ever made. A drop in the ocean. For the vast majority of American tankers, the war remained the same. It was a war where your skill wasn't about hitting the enemy, it was about surviving after he hit you. Hoping that your buddy coming up behind you could get to his side while he was reloading. The war had turned into mathematics. America was going to win it through sheer, endless, relentless numbers. The war had turned into mathematics. America was going to win it through sheer, endless, relentless numbers. But it would be a mistake to think that victory was achieved just by swamping the enemy with bodies. This wasn't just an avalanche of steel. It was a smart avalanche. It was an American avalanche. While German engineers, obsessed with their perfection, were creating their temperamental, complex, incredibly expensive Tigers, also Panthers, the Americans were doing what they did best. They were creating a tool. Simple, reliable, universal. It was in this simplicity that their true devastating advantage was hidden. The German Tiger was a masterpiece, but it was a masterpiece that required the care of a temperamental ballerina. Its complex suspension, its overstressed engine, its finicky transmission, all of it constantly broke down. Stories of these formidable beasts getting stranded in the middle of a field due to a simple mechanical failure became legendary. To fix a Tiger, you needed a team of highly skilled engineers, special equipment, weeks of time. What about the Sherman? Its engine, developed by automotive giants like Ford or General Motors, was the heart of an ordinary truck. Any American kid who grew up on a farm, who knew how to fix a tractor, could take it apart, put it back together with his eyes closed. When a Sherman broke down, its crew often fixed it right there in the field, under fire, using a hammer, a lot of cursing, plus soldiers' ingenuity. A few hours later, it was back in the fight. This reliability gave American commanders an advantage that was impossible to overstate. They could plan operations with the certainty that their tanks would get to the battlefield. German generals never had that luxury. But the Sherman's true power lay not in the tank itself. It lay in how the Americans used it. The Germans, you see, were in love with their times. Panzerwaffe**. They saw war as a series of nightly duels. Tank versus tank. Armor versus armor. They were duelists. The Americans, well, they saw war as work in a slaughterhouse. Their goal wasn't to win a duel. Their goal was to kill the beast. They were completely indifferent as to how they created a system of total, combined arms annihilation. The Sherman was the perfect centerpiece for this system. When an American tank platoon stumbled upon a camouflaged Tiger, the commander's first reaction was not attack. His first reaction was get air support. Here's where another American advantage came into play. Absolute total air supremacy. Above the Shermans, their guardian angels were always circling. P-47 Thunderbolt, P-38 Lightning fighter bombers. A Thunderbolt pilot, seeing the target a tanker had pointed out, would go into a dive, unloading his entire arsenal on the German Tiger. 850 caliber machine guns, bombs, rockets. He would turn the best tank in the world into a pile of burning scrap. If air support was busy, artillery came into play. American artillery was the queen of the battlefield. Thanks to a perfect system of communication, of fire correction, a battery of 155mm howitzers could blanket a German position in a matter of minutes. No Tiger armor could withstand a direct hit from a heavy artillery shell. Only after the target had been worked over from the air, from the ground, did the Shermans move in. They never went in alone. It was a wolfpack tactic. They didn't try to punch a Tiger in the face. That was suicide. They surrounded it. One Sherman would distract it, firing at its front, forcing the German crew to focus on it. Meanwhile, 2, 3, 4 other Shermans would come in from the flanks, from the rear, looking for vulnerable spots. They would shoot at the sides, the rear, the engine compartment. It was unfair. It was brutal. But it worked. Of course, there was the infantry. American GIs, armed with bazookas, sticky bombs, pure naked courage, would crawl toward the German tanks, trying to blow them up from close range. The Sherman was not a duelist. It was a team member. A team where everyone knew their role. This team, this system of a combined arms punch, was something the German aces had no answer for. They could be the best tankers in the world, but they couldn't fight the Air Force, the artillery, 5 tanks, a platoon of infantry all at the same time. That's not all. The Sherman's versatility allowed the Americans to turn it into any tool they needed on the battlefield. Need to clear a minefield? They'd hang special flail attachments on the Sherman. Like an angry rhino, it would plow its way through, detonating the mines. Need to burn an enemy out of a bunker? They'd mount a flamethrower on the Sherman. It turned into a dragon spewing jets of napalm. Need artillery support? They'd mount a Calliope launcher with 60 rockets on the Sherman's turret. It became a mobile, multiple launch rocket system. It was a bulldozer, a bridge layer, a recovery vehicle. It was everything. This simple, reliable tank became the basis for dozens of modifications, each one solving its own specific problem on the battlefield. The Americans didn't wait for a wonder weapon. They took what they had, then turned it into what they needed. It was the height of pragmatism, of soldierly ingenuity. German engineering perfection stood no chance against it. While American tankers were burning in the hell of Normandy, on the other side of the world, on the islands of the Pacific, a completely different war was unfolding. In this war, the Sherman was not the prey. It was a god. Where in Europe it was the burning grave, here it was the relentless executioner. The Japanese could only field pathetic, outdated light tanks from the 1930s against it. These weren't tanks. They were tin cans on tracks. Their thin armor couldn't even stop a 50 caliber machine gun burst. A 75mm Sherman shell would just punch right through them, leave a neat hole, then keep on going. The American tankers quickly realized that using armor-piercing rounds against them was a waste. They would just go clean through the Japanese tank without doing critical damage. So they switched to high explosives. Every shot turned a Japanese tank into an exploding firework. These weren't tank battles, this was an extermination. But the Sherman's real enemy in the Pacific wasn't the Japanese tanks. It was the jungle, the Japanese bunkers. Here, American ingenuity once again turned this tank into a diabolical tool. They mounted flamethrowers on it. The Sherman Zippo began its bloody work. It would crawl up to Japanese fortifications, shrugging off their machine gun fire, then spew a long, thick stream of napalm into the embrasure. It turned concrete bunkers into ovens, burning out everything alive inside. This wasn't war. This was pest control. But the triumph in the Pacific was small comfort for those who continued to burn in Europe. It was there, in the crucible of the toughest battles, that the true legend of the Sherman was born. The legend of its endless evolution. When the American command finally realized that sending standard Shermans against Tigers was deliberate murder, they did what they did best. They started upgrading. At the end of June 1944, a monster appeared on the front. It was called the M4 A3E2 Jumbo. This wasn't just a tank. It was a battering ram. The engineers took a regular Sherman, welded so much extra armor onto it that its frontal plate was thicker than a German Tiger's. It was slow, it was clumsy, but it was nearly invulnerable. The Jumbos went into the attack first. They took the hit, drawing the fire of German anti-tank guns. Their shells would clang off the Jumbo's thick hide, while the Germans frantically reloaded. Regular Shermans, tank destroyers would pop out from behind the Jumbo to deliver the counterpunch. Then came the EZ-8. This was a Sherman with a new horizontal volute spring suspension, HVSS, with wider tracks. It wasn't tougher, it wasn't deadlier, but it became incredibly smooth. The EZ-8, as it was nicknamed, could race across rough terrain without shaking the crew's souls out. Most importantly, it could fire on the move with surprising accuracy. This gave the American tankers a new, audacious tactic. They no longer stood still, waiting to be killed. They moved. They danced around the German beasts, peppering them with shells. Then it was time for the funny farms, as the soldiers called them. They started mounting diabolical devices on the Sherman's turret. The 34 Calliope rocket launcher turned the tank into a mobile multiple launch rocket system that could fire 60 rockets in a few seconds, turning an entire square of enemy defenses into a moonscape. Of course, there were the flamethrowers. The Sherman Crocodile, the Sherman Zippo, brought a terror to Europe that had previously only been seen in the jungle. They burned out German fortifications, machine gun nests, entire city blocks. For a German infantryman sitting in a bunker, There was nothing more terrifying than seeing a Sherman slowly crawling toward him, its gun spewing a jet of liquid hell instead of a shell. The Sherman's chassis became a universal platform for everything. On its base, they created the M10 Wolverine, the M36 Jackson tank destroyers, armed with powerful 90mm guns that could finally punch through a Tiger's front armor. On its base, they created the M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers that could rain down a storm of 105mm shells on the enemy. It was a mine flail, a bulldozer, a recovery vehicle, a bridge layer. American industry wasn't just building a lot of tanks. It was building a system, a system where every element supported the others, where the shortcomings of one were compensated for by the strengths of another. The Sherman, this imperfect, vulnerable, but incredibly reliable universal tank, was the heart of that system. The Germans had created the perfect sword. The Americans had created a Swiss Army knife. While the Germans searched for the perfect target for their sword, the Americans just dismantled their war machine, piece by piece, with thousands of their small but versatile blades. This was not a victory of perfection. It was a victory of pragmatism. A victory of a system over individual skill. A victory won not by quality, but by endless, relentless American quantity. But for the American soldier sitting inside that steel box, all this talk of systems, of pragmatism, was just empty noise. He knew only one thing: his tank burned. It always burned. It burned from any hit. That's why the Sherman got its real names. Names given to it in the trenches, not in the headquarters. Names written in blood. The Germans called it the Tommycooker asterisk. The British, with grim humor, nicknamed it the Ronson, after the lighter whose ad guaranteed lights up the first time, every time. The Poles, who had seen enough death to cast aside any humor, called it simply, terrifyingly, the burning grave. The American command at first tried to deny the problem. They blamed the gasoline engines, but Army studies proved this was a lie. The gasoline rarely ignited. The real cause was the diabolical placement of the ammunition in unprotected racks right above the tracks. This wasn't just an engineering mistake. It was a death sentence, built into the design. When the American tankers realized they had been sent to fight in burning coffins, they didn't mutiny. They didn't surrender. They did what Americans do best. They started to improvise. They began a war not only against the Germans, but against the flaws of their own equipment. If the Army wouldn't give them armor, they would make it themselves. The era of field modification began. They started strapping everything they could find to the Shermans. They covered them with sandbags, hoping it would stop the German times, Faust Patron times, shaped charges. They welded spare track links to the frontal armor, the turret, creating an improvised extra layer of steel. They attached logs, pieces of scrap metal, wire mesh to the sides, any junk that might give them at least 1% extra chance of survival. Their tanks turned into porcupines covered in ugly but hard-won armor. They looked terrible, but they lived a little longer. When General George Patton saw these sandbag-covered tanks, he became furious. He was a soldier, not a merchant. He hated the sight of a sloppy, improvised army. His experts told him that sandbags were not only ineffective but also increased vulnerability. The extra weight was killing the suspension. He flatly forbade their use. But Patton was more than just a tyrant. He was a fighter. He understood the problem. He proposed his own brutal but incredibly American solution. If his tanks didn't have enough armor, he would give them armor. He ordered his maintenance battalions to do what no army in the world had ever done. They started cutting armor plates from knocked out, destroyed American German tanks, welding them onto the Sherman's frontal armor. This was the ultimate act of mockery, of domination. They took the steel of their defeated enemies, made it into shields for their own warriors. They were literally reforging German might into American invulnerability. About 36 of these field expedient monsters were issued to each tank division in the 3rd Army in early 1945. The debate about the Sherman continues to this day. The author Belton Cooper, who served in the 3rd Armored Division, called them death traps, claiming the loss rate in his division reached 580%. On the other hand, Patton himself insisted that the Sherman was, all in all, a great instrument of war. Who was right? Both of them. If you look at war as a duel, tank versus tank, the Sherman was a disaster. But war is not a duel. Most Shermans were not lost to German tanks. They were lost to mines, to aircraft, to infantry, anti-tank weapons, to artillery. It was in this, the real war, that the Sherman showed its strengths. Its speed allowed it to cross the hilly terrain in Italy where German tanks got stuck. Its reliability allowed it to always be in the fight. Its simplicity allowed it to come back from the dead. But the most important answer to why the Sherman won the war was that it was rarely just a Sherman. American industry didn't just build 40,000 identical tanks. It built a system, a system where every element supported the others. The Sherman chassis, this simple, reliable platform, became the basis for dozens of diabolical instruments of war. The Germans created the perfect sword, the Tiger. The Americans created a Swiss Army knife. While the Germans searched for the perfect target for their sword, the Americans just dismantled their war machine piece by piece with thousands of their small but versatile blades. Need to kill tigers? Fine. They took a Sherman chassis, removed its turret, put on an open-top fighting compartment with a powerful 3-inch gun. Thus was born the M10 Wolverine, a tank destroyer. Need something even more powerful? They put a 90mm gun on it, capable of punching through a Tiger's front armor. Thus was born the M36 Jackson. Need to burn the enemy out of bunkers? They mounted a Crocodile or Zippo flamethrower on the Sherman. It became a Dragon. Need to saturate enemy trenches with a storm of fire? They attached a Calliope rocket launcher to its turret. It became a mobile, multiple-launch rocket system. It was a bulldozer. It was a bridge layer. It was a recovery vehicle. It was the pre-self-propelled artillery. It was everything. The Sherman wasn't just a tank. It was the heart of the unstoppable, inventive, relentless American war machine. A machine that didn't have the best tank, but it won the tank war. This was not a victory of perfection. It was a victory of pragmatism. A victory of a system over individual skill. A victory won not by quality, but by endless, relentless American quantity. When the war in Europe ended, when the American soldiers began to return home, the Shermans remained. There were so many of them that they spread across the globe like the relentless legacy of American industrial might. The story of this failed tank, this burning grave, did not end in 1945. It was just beginning. It fought in the Greek Civil War. It fought in the First Arab-Israeli War in 1948, where the Israelis, using that same American ingenuity, turned scrap metal into a formidable weapon. It went into battle again in Korea, where it faced its old Soviet counterpart, the 34. It took part in the Suez Crisis of 1956, in the Indo-Pakistani War of 1965, in the Six-Day War of 1967, in the Indo-Pakistani War of 1971, in the Yom Kippur War of 1973. This tank, created in a hurry in 1941, continued to fight long after its formidable opponents, the Tigers, the Panthers, were rusting away in museums. Some South American countries kept it in service almost until the 21st century. It became immortal. So what was the M4 Sherman? A colossal failure or a wonder weapon? It was both. It was everything America itself was. It was a failure because it was thrown into battle against an enemy it was not prepared to face. It was a failure of the generals, the planners who underestimated German engineering, who sacrificed quality for speed. That failure was paid for with the blood of thousands of American, British, Canadian, French tankers. But it was also a wonder weapon because it was the embodiment of the American spirit, a spirit that does not accept defeat, a spirit that, when handed an imperfect tool, does not complain but starts to improve it, a spirit that turns a disadvantage into an advantage. The Sherman was a wonder weapon not because of its armor or its gun. It was a wonder weapon because behind its levers sat men capable of the impossible, men who welded the armor of their enemies onto it, men who turned it into a flamethrower, a bulldozer, a rocket launcher. Most importantly, it was a wonder weapon because it was a symbol of American power, not just military power, but industrial power. This was a weapon born not in design bureaus, but in the car factories of Detroit. This was a weapon created by workers who just yesterday were building family cars. The story of the Sherman is the final answer to the question of how America won the Second World War. It didn't win because it had the best soldiers, although its soldiers were brave. It didn't win because it had the best weapons, although its weapons were effective. It won because while a German engineer was creating one perfect Tiger, an American worker was rolling 10 simple, reliable Shermans off the assembly line. It won because it could afford to lose 5 tanks to kill one. It simply crushed the Third Reich with its mass. The German tankers laughed at the Sherman. They laughed until they realized they weren't fighting a tank. They were fighting the entire American nation, its factories, its resources, its inexhaustible will to win. They could win a battle, but they could not win a war against 40,000 tanks that just said no. The story of the Sherman is the story of how imperfection, multiplied by an infinite quantity, and American ingenuity becomes an unbeatable force. These are the legends this channel exists to tell. Write in the comments what you think was the decisive factor in the Sherman's victory. Its numbers, its reliability, or the incredible bravery of the crews who went to battle in it. The memory of them is alive as long as we speak of them. But this story is not the end. Right now, 2 more legends are appearing on your screen. 2 incredible tales of men forged from steel, from fire. If you have the time, dedicate it to the memory of more heroes. Thank you for watching.